Welcome to Chains of Silence. Today's story takes us back to 1862, where two black twins were labeled gifted after a series of tests produced results no one could explain. What shocked observers wasn't just their intelligence, it was the secret hidden behind those numbers. A truth that was never meant to be written down. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Let's begin. The year was 1862, and the world was already heavy with blood, smoke, and quiet cruelty. War tore through the land, but in places far from the cannons and marching armies, another kind of violence lived quietly, wrapped in routine and law. In the southern countryside, where cotton fields stretched farther than the eye could follow, black lives were counted as property, not as people. It was in one of these forgotten places, away from large cities and official records, that two boys were born on the same night. They were twins. No one recorded the exact hour. No one marked their names at birth. They entered the world the way many black children did in that time, unnoticed, unnamed, and already claimed by a system that had decided their worth before they could breathe. Their mother was young and exhausted, her body worn down by labor that never ended. She held them only briefly before they were taken from her arms and handed to another woman to be cleaned and wrapped. From the beginning, people noticed that the twins were different, not in the way their faces mirrored each other or how their cries rose and fell in perfect rhythm, but in the way they watched. Even as infants, their eyes followed movement with unsettling focus. They did not flail or reach blindly like other babies. They observed. At first, the women caring for them whispered about it. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was a sign of trouble. In those days, anything unusual in a black child was treated with suspicion rather than wonder. Difference was dangerous. Difference invited punishment. As the twins grew, their silence became more noticeable. They spoke later than other children, but when they did, their words were clear and deliberate. They asked questions no one expected them to ask. Not childish questions, but careful ones. Questions about numbers scratched into ledgers. Questions about patterns in the fields. Questions about why certain men rode horses while others walked barefoot behind them. The overseers did not like this. By the time the twins were 6 years old, they had already learned to stay quiet when adults approached. They listened more than they spoke. They learned quickly which questions earned silence and which earned pain. Still, they continued to watch everything. It was an older man who first noticed something impossible. He worked in the storage house, counting sacks of cotton and barrels of grain. He had little education, but he understood numbers well enough to know when something didn't add up. One afternoon, he asked the twins to help him count. It was meant as a test of obedience, nothing more. They counted without hesitation, not slowly, not carefully. They spoke numbers, as if reading them from somewhere no one else could see. When the count was finished, the man checked it himself. It was exact, every time. Words spread quietly at first, then less quietly, then not quietly at all. People began to bring the twins small challenges, counting nails spilled onto the ground, repeating long strings of spoken numbers backward, remembering details of conversations they were never part of. Each time the twins answered correctly. Each time the watchers grew more uncomfortable. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pride. It was fear, because intelligence in black children did not fit the story the system depended on. Intelligence suggested awareness. Awareness suggested resistance. And resistance, even imagined, was treated as a threat. Eventually, the plantation owner heard. He was a man who valued control above all else. Order comforted him. Predictability made him feel powerful. The idea that two enslaved boys possessed abilities he did not understand disturbed him deeply. Still, curiosity outweighed caution. He ordered that the twins be brought to the main house. This was unheard of. Enslaved children were not examined. They were assigned labor and broken into obedience early. But the owner wanted answers. and answers, he believed, came from measurement. He contacted a small group of men who referred to themselves as observers. They were not scientists in the modern sense, but they believed they were men of reason. They carried notebooks, rulers, weights, and instruments meant to give shape to human ability. They believed that intelligence could be categorized, ranked, and explained. They arrived weeks later. The tests began immediately. The twins were separated and questioned individually. They were shown symbols and asked to explain their meaning. They were told stories once and asked to repeat them word for word. They were given puzzles meant for much older children. Each time, the answers came quickly and correctly. The observers exchanged glances. They whispered among themselves. They repeated the tests, convinced error had crept in. But the results did not change. The twins were reunited and tested together, then separated again, then tested in different rooms, then at different times of day. Hunger was introduced. Fatigue was forced. Still, the answers remained precise. The observers began writing faster. Their notes grew longer. Their handwriting grew messier. What disturbed them most was not the intelligence itself, but the sameness. The twins produced identical answers, often at the same moment, even when they were not within sight or sound of each other. When asked later how they knew what the other would say, they gave the same response. "We already know." That answer unsettled everyone. The owner demanded an explanation. He wanted reassurance. He wanted confirmation that this was coincidence, trickery, or exaggeration. He did not want mystery, but mystery was all he was given. The observers tried to force a conclusion that fit their beliefs. They suggested memorization. They suggested mimicry. They suggested luck. None of it held under repetition. Eventually, one of them suggested something that made the room go quiet. What if they're sharing information? The idea was dismissed quickly. There was no known mechanism for such a thing, no language for it, no acceptable explanation, and certainly no desire to explore it further. The tests continued for days. The twins never resisted. They never cried. They never asked why. They simply answered. But something else was happening. The people around them began to change. Guards stood closer, voices lowered. The twins were watched even when they slept. Their movements were recorded, their meals controlled, their isolation increased. Because the more the observers tested, the more they realized something was wrong, not with the twins, but with the assumptions the system was built on. And that made the twins dangerous. By the end of the week, the observers stopped writing full notes. Some pages were torn out. Some entries were rewritten. Certain results were summarized vaguely instead of recorded precisely. One observer suggested ending the examination altogether. The owner agreed. He ordered that the twins be returned to labor, but under supervision. He instructed that no further testing be done without his permission. He told the observers to keep their conclusions private. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, fear had just begun, because once a secret is seen, it cannot be unseen, and once silence is chosen, it must be enforced. The twins returned to the fields, but they were no longer treated like other children. They were isolated, spoken to less, watched more. People avoided meeting their eyes. Some whispered prayers when they passed. At night, their mother was forbidden from seeing them. And somewhere in a locked drawer, a notebook remained unfinished, its final pages blank, waiting for a truth no one dared to write. The silence around the twins was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, and it was tightening. The days after the observers left did not return to normal. Routine resumed on the surface, but something beneath it had shifted, like earth after a burial that had not fully settled. The twins were sent back to work alongside other children, yet they were never truly among them again. Every task they were given was watched. Every mistake was noted. Every success was treated not as skill, but as suspicion. They were no longer boys to be raised. They were variables to be contained. The overseers spoke to them differently now. Instructions were shorter. Corrections were harsher. There was a constant effort to remind them of their place, as if fear that went unexpressed might grow unchecked. The twins noticed this change immediately. They did not ask about it. They did not react outwardly, but their awareness sharpened. They understood something important had happened in that house, something that had altered how they were seen. At night, when the quarters went quiet and exhaustion silenced even the softest whispers, the twins lay awake. They did not speak to each other then. They did not need to. Their thoughts moved in patterns that felt shared, even when unspoken. Memories aligned. Questions rose and answered themselves. Where one hesitated, the other did not. Where one remembered, the other confirmed. It was not something they had learned. It was something that had always been there. Their mother felt the distance most painfully. She saw them only in passing now, and even then under watchful eyes. When she did manage to catch their attention, she searched their faces for signs of harm. She saw none. That frightened her more than bruises would have. They looked calm. Too calm. She asked one of the women what was happening. The woman shook her head and warned her not to ask such things. Curiosity had consequences, especially now. The plantation owner, meanwhile, found sleep increasingly difficult. He replayed the tests in his mind, not because he admired the results, but because he could not control them. Control had always been his greatest comfort. It justified everything he did. But the twins represented a gap in his understanding, and gaps made him uneasy. He began to wonder what else they might see. He ordered a quiet review of records, births, lineage, background, anything that might explain the anomaly. But the records were thin, incomplete, and careless. Enslaved lives were rarely documented with precision. What he found instead was absence. No explanation comforted him. So he turned to restriction. The twins were assigned separate tasks, deliberately kept apart for long hours. One worked near the stables. The other was sent to the far edge of the fields. The distance was meant to weaken whatever connection the observers had imagined. The owner told himself it was practical, necessary. It did not work. Despite the separation, the twins continued to perform with unsettling consistency. They finished tasks at the same time. They anticipated instructions before they were spoken. When one was punished for an infraction, the other flinched at the exact moment, miles away. People noticed. The whispers returned. Some said the twins were cursed. Others said they were blessed. Both conclusions were dangerous. The system had no place for either. An incident occurred late one afternoon that forced the issue further. A shipment was prepared for transport, and a discrepancy appeared in the count. Several items were missing, though no theft could be proven. The overseer, furious and embarrassed, demanded an explanation. He summoned the twins separately and questioned them. Without hesitation, both gave the same answer. The items had been miscounted at the source. The error had occurred 3 days earlier. The overseer checked the records. They were right. This was no longer coincidence. This was knowledge without access, understanding without instruction. The overseer reported the incident directly to the owner, his voice low, his posture stiff. That night, the owner sent for the twins again. There were no observers this time. No notebooks. No instruments. Only questions. He asked them how they knew things. They said they paid attention. He asked them if anyone taught them. They said no. He asked them if they spoke to each other when they were apart. They did not answer immediately. Silence filled the room. Not defiant silence. Considered silence. Finally, one of the twins spoke. "We don't need to." The owner felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room. He dismissed them abruptly. That same night, he made a decision he believed would restore order. The twins would be removed, not sold separately, as was common, but sent away under supervision to a facility where difficult cases were handled quietly, a place where questions were not asked for curiosity's sake, but for control. The owner told himself this was for everyone's benefit. He framed it as responsibility. In truth, it was fear. The transfer was arranged quickly, without ceremony. Their mother was not informed until the morning it happened. She ran after the wagon until her legs gave out, calling their names, screaming words that were swallowed by dust and distance. The twins did not cry. They watched her until she disappeared from view. They remembered everything. The journey took days. They were kept under guard, spoken to only when necessary. Other people were moved with them, but none were allowed to interact. Isolation was the point. When they arrived, the place did not look like a prison. That was intentional. It resembled a school or a hospital, depending on where one stood. Clean walls, ordered rooms, calm voices, the kind of environment meant to reassure those who believed control could be gentle. The twins were separated immediately. This time, the separation was complete. Different buildings, different schedules, no shared meals, no shared labor, no shared air. The men in charge observed carefully. They noted behavior, reactions, sleep patterns. They introduced new tests, subtler than before. Memory exercises disguised as chores. Problem-solving hidden in routine. The results were the same. Even apart, the twins mirrored each other. When one grew restless, so did the other. When one solved a task early, the other finished moments later. When one resisted sleep, the other lay awake staring at the ceiling. The men began to argue among themselves. Some wanted to push further. Others wanted to stop. There was disagreement not about what was happening, but about what it meant. One man suggested the connection was psychological. Another suggested coincidence amplified by expectation. A third said nothing at all, but avoided being alone with the twins. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere shifted. The calm routines tightened. Surveillance increased. Privileges were removed. Tests became harsher, not because results were unclear, but because the men needed reassurance that boundaries still existed. The twins sensed this. They adjusted. They answered fewer questions. They spoke only when spoken to. They followed instructions exactly, without deviation. They became quieter, smaller in presence, less remarkable on the surface. This worried the men even more, because intelligence that learned to hide was far more dangerous than intelligence that displayed itself openly. One evening, a storm cut power to part of the facility. Lanterns were lit. Shadows stretched along the walls. In the confusion, a guard noticed something that would later be described only vaguely in reports. Both twins in separate buildings turned toward the same wall at the same moment. They did not touch it. They did not speak. They simply stood there still, as if listening. The guard reported this. The report was altered. Details were removed. Language softened. The incident was described as a coincidence. But privately, the decision was made. The tests would end, not because they had answers, but because the lack of answers had become unacceptable. Some questions, once asked, could not be controlled, and some truths, once approached, threatened a structure that demanded silence above all else. The twins were reassigned again, this time to lives designed to be unremarkable. Labor without challenge, movement without choice, observation without engagement. They faded from official attention, but silence, once enforced, leaves marks. Years later, fragments of records would surface. Incomplete notes, missing pages, conflicting summaries. No conclusions, only hints that something had occurred that could not be fully contained. The twins grew older under watchful eyes, their connection never broken, only buried deeper. They learned patience. They learned restraint. They learned that survival sometimes meant appearing ordinary. And somewhere, in the spaces between words never written, the impossible secret remained, waiting. Time did not soften the place where the twins were kept. It only refined it. What had once felt temporary slowly hardened into permanence. Days repeated with mechanical precision, each one designed to drain attention, dull curiosity, and reduce the human mind to habit. For most people sent there, it worked. For the twins, it simply became another pattern to learn. They were no longer children when the next phase began. Their bodies grew stronger from labor, their faces sharper with age. But their expressions remained controlled. Those in charge mistook this for submission. They believed the danger had passed. They were wrong. The twins had learned something far more valuable than obedience. They had learned patience. Separated physically, they adjusted to a new way of being together. It was not something they discussed or planned. It emerged quietly, like breath. Awareness replaced proximity. Presence replaced touch. Where one experienced fear, the other recognized it instantly. Where one noticed change, the other prepared for it. They did not know how it worked. They only knew that it did. Occasionally, new staff arrived at the facility. Younger men, eager to prove themselves, convinced that discipline and structure could solve anything. They read the summaries of the twins' past assessments with skepticism. The language was too vague, the conclusions too cautious. To them, it sounded like superstition disguised as concern. One such man decided to observe the twins more closely. He began with simple monitoring, comparing schedules, behavior, and performance. He noticed the same things others had noticed beforehand: synchronization, anticipation, mirrored responses. Instead of reporting it immediately, he pushed further. He changed routines without notice. Meals were delayed for one twin but not the other. Work assignments were altered suddenly. Lights were extinguished early in one building and left on late in another. Each change was meant to disrupt. Each time, the twins adapted instantly. The man told himself this was coincidence. He told himself he was reading meaning into nothing. But doubt crept in slowly, feeding on repetition. Then came the night he broke protocol. He decided to test them at the same time. He arranged for both twins to be brought into separate rooms, far apart, each guarded and isolated. He asked them identical questions, starting with simple ones: names, numbers, observations about the room. Their answers matched. He escalated. He asked questions that required choice rather than recall, predictions rather than memory. Again, the answers matched. Finally, he asked something he had not planned, something personal. "What do you fear most?" There was a pause. Then both answered with the same words: being separated without reason. The man ended the session immediately. He wrote a report that night, hands shaking, struggling to find language that did not sound like madness. He avoided conclusions. He softened descriptions. He suggested increased supervision. When he submitted it, the response was swift. He was reassigned within days. The message was clear. This was not a subject to be reopened. After that, the twins were left alone again. No new tests, no changes, just routine and silence. But something had shifted. The system had blinked first. The twins noticed. They began to observe not just their surroundings, but the people within them. Patterns of authority, cycles of attention, weakness hidden beneath confidence. They learned when eyes were watching and when they were not. They learned how rules bent under pressure. And slowly, quietly, they began to prepare. Preparation did not mean escape. Not yet. It meant survival with intention. It meant keeping the connection intact while appearing harmless. It meant remembering everything. Years passed. The outside world changed. War ended. Laws shifted. Names were replaced with new ones, but the structure remained. The twins were transferred once more, this time under the justification of reorganization. New location, new overseers, same silence. The transfer was chaotic. Records were mishandled. Paperwork delayed. People moved without the usual precision. In the confusion, something rare happened. The twins were housed in the same building, not the same room, not the same wing, but close enough. The effect was immediate. What had once been awareness sharpened into clarity. Their thoughts aligned more easily. Memories flowed faster. They sensed each other's presence like pressure in the air. It was overwhelming at first. They had grown used to distance. They adapted quickly. This closeness made restraint harder. The urge to act rose constantly, but they resisted. Acting without certainty was dangerous. They needed the right moment, the right fracture, That fracture came unexpectedly. A fire broke out one night in a storage wing, small at first, then spreading rapidly due to negligence and panic. Alarms were raised late. Evacuation was disorganized. Guards shouted conflicting orders. Doors that were meant to be unlocked remained closed. Smoke filled the corridors. In the confusion, the twins moved without instruction. They followed paths that others did not see, avoiding blocked passages instinctively. They found exits before they were marked. When one encountered danger, the other adjusted direction without explanation. They emerged outside moments apart, breathing hard, covered in ash. They looked at each other openly for the first time in years. No words were spoken. The fire was contained eventually. Damage was reported, losses counted, questions asked. But no one could explain how the twins had navigated the chaos so effectively. Some guards claimed they had been guided. Others said it was luck. The official conclusion was that nothing unusual had occurred. But privately, fear returned. The twins were separated again within days. This time, the separation was different. It was not clinical. It was punitive. Restrictions tightened. Movement was limited. Communication reduced to the bare minimum. The goal was no longer observation. It was suppression. The twins felt it immediately. The distance strained their awareness. The connection did not break, but it dulled, like a signal buried under noise. They endured. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The world outside continued to shift, but their lives remained static. They aged quietly, carrying knowledge no one else could access. Then one of them fell ill. It was not sudden, but it was serious. Fever that did not break. Weakness that spread. The staff responded slowly. Resources were limited. Attention was scarce. The other twin felt it instantly, not as pain, but as absence. A hollowing sensation, like something vital receding. Panic rose, sharp and unfamiliar. For the first time, restraint faltered. He broke protocol. He spoke without being spoken to. He demanded attention. He described symptoms no one had told him. He predicted outcomes that had not yet occurred. The staff listened reluctantly. When they checked, every detail was accurate. The ill twin survived, but the incident could not be erased. Reports were written. Meetings were held. Decisions were made behind closed doors. The conclusion was final. The twins could not be allowed to age further under observation. Their existence posed a risk not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. They were reassigned again. This time, there would be no facilities, no oversight, no records. They would disappear into labor where individuality dissolved completely. The order was signed quietly. The last entry made no mention of tests, abilities, or connection. It described them as ordinary and remarkable, easily replaced. And with that, the trail ended. Years later, fragments would resurface. Contradictions, witness accounts that did not align, gaps where explanations should have been. But no complete story, only silence. And somewhere, in places never marked on any map, two lives continued, bound by something that could not be measured, controlled, or fully erased. The impossible secret remained intact, not because it was protected, but because no one ever dared to finish writing it. No one documented where the twins were sent after the final reassignment. The paperwork listed destinations that did not exist, routes that led nowhere, and supervisors who had either retired or died years earlier. It was not an accident. The system had learned that erasure was safer than explanation. The twins were moved separately, but not without intention. The people responsible believed distance would finally dissolve whatever bond had survived years of forced silence. They believed isolation would finish what observation could not. They underestimated what had already been built. The new labor sites were harsher, less organized, and far more dangerous. These were places where exhaustion replaced discipline, where survival depended on instinct more than rules. Men worked until their bodies failed. Names were forgotten quickly. Death did not require permission. In such places, attention was scarce. That scarcity gave the twins something they had not experienced in years: space. They were no longer monitored for patterns. No one recorded their behavior. No one asked questions. No one cared if they lived beyond their ability to work. The pressure that had shaped every moment of their lives loosened, not out of mercy, but neglect. And in neglect, the connection strengthened. Separated by distance and circumstance, the twins began to sense each other not as presence, but as direction. When one was in danger, the other adjusted his movements without knowing why. When one encountered opportunity, the other felt a pull toward change. They did not plan reunion. They did not need to. It happened slowly, through choices that seemed ordinary to anyone watching. A decision to change work crews. A willingness to take risk where others hesitated. A refusal to settle where the ground felt wrong. Years passed like this. Their bodies aged. Their faces changed. Scars replaced youth. But the awareness remained steady and quiet. It matured with them, becoming less urgent, more deliberate. They no longer reacted to it instinctively. They listened to it. Eventually, without announcement or recognition, they found themselves working on the same stretch of land. They did not recognize each other immediately. Time had altered them. Hunger, labor, and injury had reshaped their features. When they finally did look at one another closely, the recognition came not through sight, but through certainty. No embrace followed. No words of reunion. They continued working side by side, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. To anyone watching, they were two aging laborers sharing the same burden. But beneath the surface, the alignment was complete. Their thoughts settled into familiar rhythm. Awareness sharpened. Memory flowed freely again. They remembered everything they had been forced to forget. They also understood something new. Survival had changed them, but it had also taught them patience beyond fear. They no longer needed to resist openly. The system that had tried to erase them was already decaying under its own weight. Laws shifted, power fractured, control weakened in places where it once seemed absolute. Silence, once imposed, had begun to spread in unintended directions. The twins used this time carefully. They observed people the way they always had, but now with greater understanding. They learned which men enforced rules out of cruelty, and which did so out of habit. They learned when to speak, when to remain invisible, and when absence mattered more than presence. They became useful, not remarkable, not suspicious. Useful. They offered solutions when problems arose. They anticipated shortages. They prevented accidents. Their value grew quietly. No one questioned why. In places like this, competence was welcomed without curiosity. And so, the twins remained. Years later, when freedom arrived unevenly and without clarity, they did not celebrate loudly. They did not rush toward promises that had failed others before them. They waited. They watched. They chose carefully. When they finally left, they left separately, not because they feared separation, but because they understood its power. They settled in different regions, far enough apart to avoid notice, close enough to remain aware. They took different names, built different lives, worked different trades. They did not seek recognition. They did not seek explanation. They sought stability. People who knew them described them as calm, thoughtful, reserved. Men who seemed to understand things before they were spoken. Men who rarely argued, but were almost always right. Some said they were lucky. Others said they were strange. No one guessed the truth. As time passed, the twins aged into anonymity. They watched generations rise and fall. They saw systems repeat old mistakes under new language. They recognized patterns others missed. They spoke rarely of the past, even to those closest to them. When one of them grew ill in old age, the other felt it long before the message arrived. He prepared without knowing why. When the end came, it was quiet. There were no witnesses who understood its significance. The remaining twin did not mourn publicly. He carried the absence the way he had learned to carry everything else. Internally. Years later, after his own death, fragments surfaced. A bundle of papers found among forgotten records, notes written by different hands, separated by decades, describing the same to men in different places. Descriptions that should not have matched, but did. Historians dismissed them as coincidence. Archivists filed them incorrectly. The fragments never formed a complete story, because the most important parts were never written. No one recorded how the twins understood each other without words. No one explained how awareness survived distance, punishment, and erasure. No one documented what frightened the observers enough to stop asking questions. The impossible secret remained exactly where it had always been, between what was seen and what was never allowed to be explained. And so, the story ends the way it lived, not with answers, but with silence. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video. And if you want more stories that history tried to silence, subscribe to Chains of Silence. Your support keeps these voices from disappearing.